This is a tutorial that a lot of you have asked about. This is one of those common questions we get a lot about silicone, and we've covered this in other tutorials, but it's kind of spread out throughout our video library. So I want to consolidate that knowledge here. And in this video, we're going to explain the basics of pigmenting and coloring silicone. And there's a lot of language that gets confused sometimes when people refer to things as dyes or pigments and things like that. And the main thing you want to think about with silicone or any kind of material that we mix up and use in this universe is there's intrinsic and extrinsic coloring. So intrinsic coloring is mixed into the material. So that would be dyes, pigments, and that sort of thing. And some of that language is used interchangeably, kind of like when you say resin and plastic. Those are used to refer to something like you would a car. It encompasses a lot of different vehicles. So think of dyes and pigments as really the same thing, whereas a paint is something that goes on the exterior of something. So you don't want to get too hung up on that language of, is that a dye or is that a pigment? The important thing is, are we internally pigmenting something, intrinsically pigmenting it, or are we painting it? And for the sake of this video, we're going to be focusing on intrinsic coloring, which is mixing the color into the raw material so that when it cures, it becomes the color that we want it to be. And with silicone, that's really important because silicone, we want to create a base color that's conducive to painting. And ideally, since silicone is translucent, to really exploit those properties, we want to have a part that's as close to that paint scheme that we can get so that as little painting is necessary as possible. Obviously, if you're doing a realistic silicone head or doll or creature or whatever, there's going to be a lot of paint work on the exterior of that. But again, you want to minimize that because in order to preserve that translucency of that silicone, you want as much of that color to be embedded in the silicone as possible. So, quick word about the color to match. This is one of those kind of weird color theory things that's really, I wouldn't say exclusive to silicone, but it really becomes a big issue with silicone. With silicone color matching, I typically recommend matching the lightest shade on an individual skin color. So if you're matching an actor or actress, or if you're matching a silicone doll or whatever, you want to pigment to the lightest shade because when you're coloring with translucent colors, you can always go darker, but you can't go lighter. So find the lightest shade on the subject that you're matching and pigment to that. If you go too dark, again, remember the only way to make something lighter would be to opaque it, which of course destroys those properties that you are using silicone for. So what I typically do if it's me, or if I'm doing an actor or actress, or I'm simulating a hand or face or foot or whatever, I look on the inside of their arm. This is usually a good, easy to access place that's not exposed to as much sunlight and will give you a good idea of their overall, a good base color to pigment. So find the lightest shade on the inside of their wrist or forearm, and that's a good place, a good starting point for color matching. Now, for this video, I'm just going to create a general purpose fair flesh tone. And I'm going to try to shoot for about like the inside of my forearm here. But remember, obviously this is all different. And the reason I'm going with a fair flesh tone for this is that is typically one of the harder things to match than some of the darker skin tones. Some of the darker ones are actually easier to achieve with some of our silicone pigments. So for this, I'm going to be using a combination of silicone pigment and flocking to achieve the color. And along the way, we'll discuss why we're using those things. Okay, the silicone I'm going to be mixing up is the Platsil FS10. The FS, of course, stands for fast setting. This is one of the newer formulas that is specifically for some of the weirder applications like some of the casting and things like that. Now, I'm going to dispense some A and B into some mixing cups. And before I do that, I want to make sure these are clearly marked A and B. And that way, as I'm using those, I know exactly which one is which. Also a good idea to mark your caps. One of those little stupid things that happens, and it happens to all of us, is getting the caps reversed, and then those drips of the opposite component get down in there and can start catalyzing the opposite component, and you get globules of the different material. So to prevent that, make sure you mark your caps, and that way you don't have to worry about that. Typically not a big deal, but that it can happen, so be prepared for that. Now, Plat-Sil FS10 is one of the reasons I like this formula for what I'm about to do. Is it's great for silicone casting. It's very similar to Gel 10, except it's lower viscosity and actually a little bit faster if that's at all possible. It's about an 8-minute working time and a 25-minute demold. And one of the benefits to this being low viscosity, it'll work really well in this ear mold that has a lot of really thin sections. So we're going to do that without degassing. Now what I want to do is I want to pour enough in here that I can pigment both sides, my A and B, and get these to match before I mix them together. Now, if I'm doing a larger piece, like you might have seen our Bride of Biddy video where we did the Bride of Biddy head that was brushed in, a brushed in silicone skin. And for that, I went ahead and prepared 2 quart mixing cups of Gel 10 A and B, and I matched those colors. So I'm going to do the same thing here, and we can go ahead and set these aside now. What I want to do here is, again, here's my dedicated stir sticks. We want to have enough material, so if we're making a skin or we're brushing up a whole body or whatever, we want to have enough material set aside so if we're doing multiple batches, we can work out of this and everything will be consistent. So we don't have to worry about exact matching of each layer. So if you're having to build up in multiple layers and you want those all to be consistent, make sure you start out. In some cases, you might need to pre-mix a gallon of A and B to exactly the color you want. And if you want to get really precise on this, you can weigh all of this out. But for this is going to be pretty straightforward stuff. So I'm going to use about a kind of a pea-sized glob of white silicone pigment. This is what I start with for when I'm doing fair skin tones. I start with white and then build up from that point. Now that's it for the pigment. And this is one of those things too where if you do a lot of this, you're going to go through a lot of these little stir sticks, and also I keep cases of these little popsicle sticks handy, as you will definitely use a lot of them. And this is where it's should go without saying, but do not put pigment into a material that is not designed for that. If you start trying to mix in, there's some water-based and oil-based materials that will not suspend or will not dissolve in a material that, like if a water-based pigment put into an oil-based material is not going to want to disperse in that properly. And it'll take a lot of work to get it to disperse. And then over time, it may not be stable. So make sure you're using pigments that are appropriate for what you are putting it in. And heaven forbid, if you just go totally crazy with that, you could easily wind up contaminating platinum silicone, which is a really expensive mistake. So this is, of course, our white silicone pigment, but be aware of that. White polycolor does not work. White food coloring does not work. Make sure if you're trying something in a pinch, do a small test to make sure it's compatible. Now you see we have enough white in there that we still have our translucency. Now the white is going to provide our base color. It's kind of our background against which these flocking colors can show up. So the first thing I'm going to add is our flesh tone pigment. Again, I'm matching my arm, so I'm going to go with a kind of a light flesh tone here. And I'm going to go somewhat fast for the sake of the video, but this is all just going to put a little bit of the tan. the more colors you use, the more realistic the flesh tone. And this is also where just a good understanding of color theory, I don't have one handy, but typically one of those little color wheels you can pick up at a hobby store is really, really helpful for this. If you're new to mixing colors like this, it'll help you figure out which colors will complement your flesh tone. Now red, you want to be really sparing with the red. Depending on how vascular the part of the body is that you're recreating, sometimes you might use a lot of red, but typically you want to be careful not to put too much. So I'm deliberately starting small here because I don't want to go too crazy yet. But here we have a very fair flesh tone. And now we're going to build up from there. Because again, remember, with any of this stuff, we can always add more. We can't take it back out. So be aware of that and move slowly. If you're starting out with this, you don't want to be just throwing stuff in willy-nilly. The only one I know I can really go nuts with is this flesh tone color, because this is something it's basically like flesh color, and this is going to be the closest to just an average skin color. And because we're adding roughly the same amount to both the A and B, we don't have to worry about the mix ratio being thrown off. This is a 1-to-1 mix ratio, but we want to make sure we're putting about the same amount in each one, even though it is a small amount of pigment and flocking. That makes sure that when we go to mix this all up later on, everything is still, we're not going to throw off the ratio by putting all the pigment in one side or the other. I'm going to go ahead and put a little bit more red in there, and this should about do it. Might have to add a little bit more of the flesh, but that's already getting really close to what we want. One thing that's really helpful just to understand the way this color works is to look at your palm. Your palm is a good example of just how many colors are at work to create your individual flesh tone. You have all kinds of different colors, oranges, yellows, reds, so there's no one flesh tone that you have going on there. So, and this is where also the role of flocking is really critical here. Flocking, because it doesn't suspend, like the silicone pigment, that actually dissolves into the color and becomes part of the silicone. The flocking does not, so it maintains an independence from the rest of the silicone as a little fiber, a little particle of color. And that's a lot more accurate to simulate human skin and just organic tissue in general. So you get these little spots of color, which are much more accurate than just one homogeneous color. Now, I could probably stop there. I'm pretty close to that part of my palm, but I'm going to go add just a little bit more tan. And one of the common mistakes I see when people are starting out with this, especially when they're doing prosthetic work, is over-pigmenting the silicone, adding too much pigment at once. So this is a good exercise to start out small and work up to the pigment, the color that you want, because it's real easy, especially with pre-made flesh tones, to add way too much of that and get this kind of Barbie doll color that's just looks horribly out of place on the skin surface of your subject. So again, there's a very fair shade, again, to right to kind of the inside of my arm. We're going to go ahead and stop there. Now the mold I'm going to put this into, this is a resin mold. This is made with our Easy Flow, I think this is Easy Flow 90 for this particular mold. And this is just a solid plastic mold. And we covered this in a lot of other videos, but compatibility is super important. Make sure whatever your mold material is, that you've worked backwards from that and you know everything is compatible up to and including the mold that you're using. One of the saddest stories we hear is when people make beautiful molds that are completely incompatible with the material they're pouring into the mold. So if you're using something that we've never heard of, it is up to you to figure out, make sure that everything is compatible in your process. Now, I've already released this with some of our 2500 spray release, but you can also use the Super Release PTR, and the epoxy par film also works really well for this. This is kind of my go-to release. You've probably seen this in a lot of our videos. The Super Release PTR, this was formerly known as Eject It 33. This is a fantastic release for keeping silicone from sticking to a lot of different surfaces. Okay, now we're ready to mix up our silicone. And again, this is where we want to keep track of our A and B, make sure we're using A and B. And because everything is the same color, there is a chance that you could easily do 2 part A's or 2 part B's. So always make sure as soon as you're done measuring out one component, set that aside so you know you've already poured that. You don't ever want to get distracted and accidentally do 2 of one component. Again, we've all been there, we've all done that. It is possible to do even after you've been doing this for decades. Okay, so I've got 30 grams of part A, and now I need 30 grams of part B. And I always like to just tap the scale a little bit just to make sure that I'm getting an accurate reading. Okay, so there's our silicone. And again, one of the nice things about the FS series is it's bizarre. This is one of those formulas that when I read the specs on, I thought it had to be a misprint because it was it's had such a long open time relative to the cure time. This has an 8-minute working time and a 25-minute demold, which just seems wildly implausible. Typically, if you have something like a 25-minute demold time, you would have like a 2-minute working time. But this is not the case. So we have plenty of time. 8 minutes, if you have the right equipment, is plenty of time to vacuum degas, although this is pretty low viscosity. So a lot of simple applications like this, there's no need to vacuum degas. But if you're doing anything critical, in anything you don't want to have micro bubbles on the surface of, then it's a good idea to vacuum degas. And again, that low viscosity means that it gives up those air bubbles really fast in a vacuum chamber. Okay, so we've got our silicone mixed up, and I'm just going to pour in one spot in as thin of a stream as possible. And the reason I want to pour in one spot is I want the air to flow away from where I'm pouring. Because we're going to have air bubbles from mixing, but we just want that air to flow away from where I'm pouring and then come to the surface and break. And this is one of the reasons why you want to get your silicone or resin or whatever you're working with, you want to get it mixed and poured as soon as possible, because the faster you get everything into the mold, the faster those little bubbles like that can come to the surface and break. Now, if we've mixed everything really good, then you can do what I'm doing here, which is scraping everything out of the cup. If you have not, if you have neglected mixing really accurately and scraping the bottom of your bucket, then I would not recommend doing that, because what you'll wind up with, and this is, again, one of those common mistakes people do when they're starting out, is they don't get everything mixed up really good, but when they get to the end of the pour, they realize, man, if I had that last little bit in the bucket, that would fill up the mold. So they start scraping everything out. And then what happens is their mold or their cast or whatever is otherwise perfect, but the top of it is all striated and sticky and a big mess. And that is because this material around what was left over was not thoroughly mixed. So be aware of that. Good troubleshooting tip. And you can already see from the top of this that that has that mottled look of like organic tissue, where just if we had just put silicone pigment in, we would just have one flat homogeneous color. Now it'd be fairly realistic because it's translucent, but it's lacking that mottled look that we have with real human tissue. Okay, it's about 25 minutes later, give or take a little bit, and our silicone has set up. So this is our FS10. Again, just to go over those physical properties again, this is a platinum silicone that's fast setting, hence the FS abbreviation. And this is an 8-minute working time and a 25-minute demold, and that's all at room temperature. And that is a really important consideration anytime you're working with platinum silicone. This time of year, I'm filming this right on the end of the year. This is December 30, 2022. So it's relatively cool here, not, it's Dallas, so we have almost spring-like weather sometimes in the winter. But just be aware that when the temperature drops, if you're in an unheated workshop, your silicone is going to slow way down. And if it's too cold, it's not going to set at all. So be aware, temperature is a big part of this. Now, our silicone is set up. I'm just going to work up that edge. And this is a resin mold. So FS10 is a really strong silicone, but still this is a little green, so I don't want to just yank it right out. And it's that top of the ear that just takes a little extra effort. And there we have it. There is our finished ear and our easy flow mold. Now, quick word about this ear and what to do next with this. Our resin mold, a mold like this, again, this doesn't take much release. If we're about to pour up another cast, and a lot of times when we spray this once, we could probably get several casts out of it before we have to spray it again. The release is more to ease the silicone out of the mold without it ripping or snagging on the mold. So depending on the plastic you poured that with, sometimes just minimal release is ideal just to help it pull out of the mold without tearing. But just remember, whatever release you use to get your part out to keep it from sticking, that will also need to be cleaned off the part. So here we have our part. It's still a little green because again, it is cold here. So you saw that ear, if I stretch on it right now, it's probably going to deform a little bit. So I'm going to let that sit a little bit more before I really start monkeying with it. But since we used the 2500 spray release to keep this from sticking, this does have a little bit of release residue on the part. So in order to prepare this for painting, what I typically do is wipe this down really good with acetone. And acetone is a great way to remove any kind of mold release residue, mainly on silicone parts like this. The acetone won't affect the silicone. Wipe that down really good with a clean paper towel, and then you're ready to paint. And this is another, I'm going to link at the end of this to our silicone painting tutorial, because real important when you're making parts out of silicone and then transitioning to painting, it's really important to make sure that you do that as soon as possible and that you paint your part while it's still very fresh. The longer this part sits around, it could still be painted, but we're not going to get a really good chemical bond between the silicone that we're painting with and the original part. So the fresher it is, the better chance we have of getting a really good bond and making sure that all becomes one cohesive piece of silicone. So if you're doing silicone dolls or props or anything, especially something that's going to be handled a lot, and you want to make sure that silicone, the new silicone paint, bonds really well to the part, make sure you do that as soon as possible. And if you're new to this, always a good idea to have the little scrap parts like this ear cast up to do paint tests with, and just experiment with different techniques and different solvents and see what works best for you. But my typical practice for this is wiping this down with acetone and with a clean paper towel, and once that all dries off, then I'm ready to paint. And typically for painting, you'll see in our tutorial on painting, I typically use gel tin as a paint base for any of the Plat Seal gels. So there you have the process of basic flesh tone. Again, this is a fairly light flesh tone here, but a basic flesh tone using both silicone pigment and flocking to intrinsically pigment a silicone part. And again, at the end of this, I'm going to link two different videos, one on airbrushing with gel tin and another on just standard, just basic nuts and bolts silicone painting techniques. So be sure to check those out. And in the video description, I'm going to link to our video library online. That is a great resource. If you're starting out with all this and you really need some just good resources on silicone casting, painting, all those techniques, I highly recommend go to our resources library. You'll see there's a video library. Click on that. It'll take you to an index page of all different video categories. And if you're new to all of this whole molding and casting universe, one of the best things you can do is equip yourself with kind of a mental arsenal of different techniques. Starting out, that's probably the best thing you can do is just fill up your brain with as many techniques and approaches as you can and make sure you have a good knowledge of all the materials available, because that is half the battle of just understanding the material science behind all of this before you proceed. And take notes, and remember, this is not typical consumer materials. This is definitely a trade skill that you're taking on. So anyway, on that note, Happy New Year to you all. Thanks again for watching. And of course, as always, if you haven't already, be sure to click the like button and subscribe and the bell icon if you want to be notified when we produce new content. And thanks again for all your support. As of right now, I think we've now been on YouTube for about over 16 years. So thanks again for all of your support through all of this. We recently celebrated our 18th anniversary. So hopefully another 18 to come. But thanks again for your support, and thanks for watching.